Recently, Redeemed Zoomer released a video, 10 reasons why he's not Eastern Orthodox. As expected, one of those reasons is icon veneration. I thought it'd be a good idea to go through his arguments that he provides, and I would give my feedback on those arguments. If you find this topic interesting, or icons in general, hit that subscribe button for future content. I do original research from good resources to provide you with good, solid information about that topic. Without any further ado, let's get right into it.
Next up is the issue of icon veneration. This has been debated a lot in recent years, starting with Gavin Ortland's video on icons. People responded to him, he responded to them. I'll leave a link in the description. You can watch and judge for yourself who makes better arguments. But Eastern Orthodoxy is famous for their icons. Their churches are covered in icons of Jesus, Mary, and the saints, and they're not just for decorative or teaching purposes. They venerate those icons because they believe the honor given to the image passes to the prototype.
So up to this point, the information that he's providing sounds pretty good to me. We do have images of saints, Jesus and Mary in our churches. We do venerate them, and we do believe that the honor doesn't go to the image or the paint itself, but to the person who's depicted in those images. The whole purpose of icon veneration is not to venerate icons, contrary to what's in the name. The purpose is to give honor to the person depicted, and veneration just simply describes the physical act that's being done. But the intended honor is directed to the person depicted, not to the icon itself. So that's what we mean when we say that the honor paid to the image passes over to the prototype.
That's what St. Basil says, and in context, he was not talking about icons. He was talking about the relation of the Son to the Father, but they believe that logic applies.
So this reference to the quote of St. Basil is a reference to something that St. Basil wrote in his book on the Holy Spirit. And in this teaching, St. Basil is using the analogy of honoring an image of a king. And the whole idea is that in the same way that when a person gives honor to the image of a king, there's not two honors, but there's one honor by the image to the king. In the same way that when you worship Jesus, you're not worshiping a different worship than worship to the Father. There's one worship to one God through the Son to the Father. So there's a Christological Trinitarian analogy in icon veneration. In this context, yes, it's the Trinity. However, St. Basil is using the example of icon veneration, specifically an icon of a king. So the principle applies directly to venerating icons of saints, which has the exact same principle, right? So in the same way that honoring an image of the king, the honor passes over to the prototype, the same exact thing happens when you honor an image of a saint, the honor passes to the saint. So the principle is good. The context being the Trinity doesn't take away from the how relative that example is for icon veneration. So the example is very good, and it is the identical principle that we apply in icon veneration. And Protestants apologists will try to downplay that quote because of the context of the Trinity. But again, the context of the Trinity does not take away the fact that St. Basil is talking about veneration of an icon, of an emperor, of a king. Okay, so that's absolutely in the text. It's very clear. Let's continue.
I think icons are windows into heaven. It's a very big deal for them.
By the way, I personally never call icons windows into heaven. This might be controversial to some people, but the reason is simple. For one, the fathers don't call icons windows into heaven. And I think the reason why they don't is because not all icons are windows into heaven. Some icons are windows into historic events, right? So you think about the crucifixion icon or the nativity icon. Those are not windows into heaven. Those are windows into historic events in salvation history. Windows into heaven applies much more to portraits of saints who we believe are in heaven. So it's not necessarily a bad phrase, but it's just not something that the fathers used when authoritatively defining icons for the church. So you can take or leave that phrase. It's something I would say didactic or pastoral, but it's definitely not a phrase that comes out of our authoritative resources. So I'd say Redeemed Zoomer, if you don't like that phrase, don't use it. I don't use it, right? So if I'm explaining to people what icons are, I don't personally call them windows into heaven. I don't think it's a good description of all the icons that we have. It seems to be referring to only a specific kind of icon, those portraits of saints who we believe are in heaven. But of course, icons are ultimately about truth, whether that truth be in heaven or that truth be historical in some event in salvation history or a martyrdom or something like that. So the point is always truth, sometimes heaven, right? So if you don't like that phrase, don't say that phrase. You don't need to. It's not in our fathers. It's not in the Council of Nicea II. They never called icons windows into heaven. Seems to be a relatively recent title for icons. Let's continue.
One of their infallible ecumenical councils is Nicea II, which claims...
Now, I want to stop right here, just make a quick quote. He said one of their infallible councils. Now, that's an ambiguous way to say how we believe about Nicea II with regards to its infallibility. We believe that the teaching of Nicea II is infallible. That doesn't necessarily mean that every single word that was said in the Acts of Nicea II is perfectly without error, right? We believe that there can be certain errors that were said or done in individuals at the council, but we believe that ultimately the Holy Spirit guided the fathers of Nicea II to the correct conclusion and teaching about icons. So it's a little bit ambiguous to say infallible council, because of course we believe that the Holy Spirit was guiding the fathers at that council to make the correct decision on these issues, but it doesn't mean that every single thing spoken there was absolutely infallible. We don't believe that the Acts of Nicea II are divine scriptures or something like that. Certainly not in the same way that the Bible is, right? So I just want to point that nuance there, that yes, infallible in regards to its teaching, but not infallible in regards to every single little detail that was written about that council.
Infallibly that icon veneration is an unbroken tradition of the apostles.
Now this is huge. This is a huge point, and I can't emphasize this enough. Fun fact, the Council of Nicea II never said that the apostles venerated icons. They never even say that icon veneration is an apostolic practice, okay? Now, that might be controversial for a lot of Orthodox people, but we have the Acts. We have the whole Acts available. You can get them for yourself and read through them. I know I've read through them, and I've not seen any reference to icon veneration, the physical act of bowing, okay, specifically in the Greek language, proskineo, to icons being an apostolic practice. Never says that. It does talk about icon veneration as being allowed and pious and encouraged and being patristic, ecclesiastical, and following from the theology of the apostles, from the faith of the apostles, and being the application of the faith of the apostles, but they always stay one step shy of explicitly stating that the apostles bow down to images. Okay, so this is an interpretation from Gavin Ortland. This is an interpretation from other Protestant apologists to try to undermine Nicea II, to make it out to be this, joke historical council, but the fathers of Nicea II were actually quite nuanced in their teaching on icon veneration and icons and the apostles, right? It does teach very explicitly that the apostles put up icons for the sake of encouraging piety and conversion of pagans, but when it comes to defending the bowing down to images, the proskinesis of icons, it calls it a patristic practice, a pious practice, a practice of the church, okay? So, and a practice grounded in the apostolic faith. So just need to be really careful with this language and not go beyond what the fathers of Nicea II taught. And I'm not saying that the apostles didn't venerate icons. I'm just saying that the Council of Nicea II never explicitly said that the apostles venerated icons. And I think that's a very important nuance. So if this is a big hang up for you, and I think it is for Gavin Ortland, for Redeemed Zoomer, and others, then you should just be aware of the fact that the council never even explicitly said that. And a lot of Orthodox people interpret the council as having said that, but that's one particular interpretation. Not every Orthodox person interprets Nicea II as claiming that the apostles venerated icons. In fact, Redeemed Zoomer will acknowledge that here shortly, but I think that's very important. And I think that that's a blocker that's been set up by the apologist. It was not set up by the fathers of Nicea II. So let's continue.
Which means, if orthodoxy is correct, icon veneration has always been practiced in the Christian churches.
Again, the Council of Nicea II never said that. So he's not speaking from the council at this point. He's speaking a particular interpretation of that council.
Here's the problem. All the best historical evidence completely contradicts that. Before 325 AD, before Constantine, before there was this massive influx of pagans into Christianity, there's absolutely no evidence of icon veneration.
So the fact that Nicea II never explicitly says that the apostles bowed down to images means that all of this point about the evidence is completely irrelevant. Just doesn't even matter, right? Because if the goalposts are set by Nicea II, which we all agree the goalposts are set by Nicea II, and those goalposts don't include that the apostles bowed down to images, then we don't need to seek out evidence that the apostles bowed down to images, because it's irrelevant whether they did or not, because it's not defined in the goalposts outlined in Nicea II. So he's going to go on here about how, try to debunk the notion that the apostles did proskinesis, bowing down to images. But again, the council never said that. They never explicitly said that the apostles bowed down and did proskinesis to images. Okay, the council calls this an ecclesiastical practice, a church practice, a pious practice of the fathers. Okay, and a practice of the applied apostolic faith. But it always stays one step short of saying that the apostles bowed down to images. So all of this, lack of evidence, all these things doesn't even matter. It's not even relevant to this point. He's just basically set up a particular interpretation, a very rigid fundamentalist type interpretation of Nicea II, and then he's attacking that interpretation. But again, not all Orthodox even have that interpretation of Nicea II, which I find very interesting because he does acknowledge that later on. Let's continue.
And mountains of evidence to the contrary. At most in the early church, there were some images for teaching purposes. Often they tried to avoid directly depicting Jesus. Instead, they just draw a fish representing Jesus.
This is also not true. Okay, so he's trying to present the archaeology like there's this evolution from symbols of fish into images. That's an old, outdated belief. Our earliest Christian symbols are just as old as our earliest Christian icons. Okay, those frescoes and paintings of scenes from the life of Christ and Old Testament scenes, those are just as old as the fish symbols that we have. So it's not true, that there's this step-by-step evolution from symbols to images. Images and symbols both seem to go back as far as we can see into the archaeological records. Just throwing that out there.
And sometimes they did depict Jesus. Either way, it was just for teaching purposes. Nobody venerated icons, and there are many other examples of...
And again, these blanket statements, right? Nobody venerated icons. How do you know that nobody venerated icons when icon veneration was a normal part of Greco-Roman culture, right? Most likely people did venerate icons. Now, did Nicea II say that the apostles venerated icons? No, it didn't explicitly say that, but did the apostles venerate icons? Maybe they did, and maybe their followers did. In fact, it's likely that their followers did, again, because of Greco-Roman culture. And you can see that applied, for example, to icons of the king, the emperor, right? You see that in multiple early church fathers, that images of the emperor were venerated. So to have this statement that nobody venerated icons is just, it's not that stable, right? It's not that guaranteed. It's not that obvious as he makes it seem. We don't know whether or not, everybody was venerating icons. It seems possible that they were, even though, we don't necessarily have every single, thing recorded that the early church was doing. It does seem likely. But again, what matters at the end of the day is the goalpost set by Nicea II. The fact that Nicea II never explicitly says that icon bowing goes back to the very beginning, that's very significant and very important here. But he's going to, again, set up a particular interpretation of Nicea II that makes it seem like a joke interpretation of history, and then he's going to attack that particular interpretation.
Many early Christian apologists saying Christians had no images at all because that was a pagan thing. Like pagan apologists, like Celsus, would mock the Christians for not having images.
Yeah, this point is absolutely easily debunkable, right? The lifetime of Origen, when this book was written, we have icons that are just as old as this book, right? We have 3rd century icons in Rome, in Syria, which go back to the time when this book was written. So to use this book as proof that the Christians didn't have icons, or that some Christians didn't have icons, Well, what about the churches that did have icons from the same time that are contemporary with this book? So obviously, many Christians did have icons, and maybe this book is just being misinterpreted, or maybe Origen is speaking from a local tradition. I think it's being misinterpreted, but let's continue.
They'd say, you Christians are so lame. You don't have altars and temples and images in your worship like we do. If your God's real, why don't you have an image of your God? And the response of the Christians wasn't, what the heck? Yes, we do have images. We venerate these images. The tradition of the apostles. They would say, yeah, the reason we don't have images is X, Y, and Z. This is what Origen says. This is what Tertullian says. Many other early Christian apologists. Now, the Orthodox are going to say, you can't use Origen. He was a heretic. Now, yes, many of Origen's beliefs ended up being condemned as heresies hundreds of years later, but he was very respected during his time.
Yeah, this argument to dismiss Origen as a heretic, I never liked this argument. This is one point, I will give this to Redeemed Zoomer, is when Orthodox apologists just outright dismiss Origen. I don't think that that's the right move. I do think that Origen serves as a witness to early Christian practice. I do think that Origen serves as a good teacher on many points. And it's not just me who thinks that, it's the Orthodox fathers who think that. The Cappadocian fathers studied Origen of Alexandria and learned a lot from him as a great biblical scholar and theologian. So, of course, the Orthodox Church doesn't just dismiss Origen outright because he's considered a heretic. The Orthodox Church applies discernment with Origen, discerning the things that are good and the things that are bad. That's the real Orthodox response. So I would say here to Redeemed Zoomer, like, yeah, you're right that it's not correct to dismiss Origen outright as a historic witness. He is valid, but you can't take Origen in isolation. Origen is living at the same time as some of the catacombs in Rome, which have images in them, and Dura Oropos, which has images in those as well. So you have to take all of the evidence together and say, well, if Origen is saying that the church didn't have images, well, then he doesn't certainly represent all the churches, because certainly there were other churches around that did have images. That would be my response. And I would like to see more Orthodox apologists engage with Origen instead of dismiss him, because I think that's the more consistent position. Let's continue.
And some of the greatest defenders of orthodoxy, like Athanasius, had great respect for Origen. But let's pretend he was a heretic. Let's pretend he was more heretical than Arius, Nestorius, Servetus, and, your Unitarian Universalist pastor down the street combined. Let's say he was the most heretical person ever. He's not a liar. Nobody has ever accused him of being a liar. So we don't have to agree with his theology. We don't have to agree with his theology in rejecting of icons. We don't even have to agree with his rejection of images. But he is a reliable historical witness as to what the church was doing during his time.
Yeah, I would agree, except for that he's a reliable witness what the church is doing. He would be a reliable witness of what his church was doing, right? So we can't take Origen in isolation. I'm not saying that, I'm not even saying that he represents iconoclasm or aniconism in his church, because I don't even grant that he's aniconic. But even if we did, it would be only his local church that's really being represented here. He doesn't speak for the wider church. Again, put it in context. We have icons which are contemporary with Origen still in our hands today, that are in Rome and that are in Syria and other places as well. We have 3rd century icons. So just keep in mind that no, he's not, obviously, if he's aniconic, he's not representing the church. He's representing his church. And I think that's a very important distinction.
You could completely disagree with Origen. You could believe in icon veneration, but you could admit that the early church did not venerate icons. You could admit that icon veneration is a development. Because if icon veneration was practiced in the churches during Origen's time, it would make absolutely no sense for him, as well as a bunch of other early Christian apologists, to agree with the charge, to not deny the charge that Christians do not have images in their worship.
So I just want to make a comment here. It's very, very important to explain what do you mean by veneration. The English word venerate doesn't even have an equivalent in Koine Greek, which the fathers of Nicea II were using. And so this is very important to understand, because there's going to be a lot of equivocation going on, misunderstanding going on, if you don't understand how icon veneration was talked about in its original languages, the language of the early church and language of the Greek fathers. So basically, the fathers were using the word proskinesis and ospazome, some of the main words used for veneration, but those just simply mean to bow down oneself. Ospazome means to greet. Now, greeting is typically expressed with a kiss, but not always, right? It doesn't necessarily have to mean kiss. So you have this interesting situation where the fathers never say, and I'm talking about the fathers of Nicea II, never say explicitly that the apostles give proskuneo to icons, that they bowed down to icons. Never says that they even give aspazome, okay, this greeting to icons. So can we say that proskuneo is a development in the church practice? I think yes, and I think the fathers of Nicea II actually acknowledge that as well. But some people will take the word veneration and expand it to not just mean bowing down, but to mean other ways of respecting or honoring images. And I think if you make the term veneration broad enough, then you could include perhaps ways that the apostles were treating or handling early Christian icons. So it's just very important to define your terms here. It can get really lost in the weeds if you don't do this. I would say be very specific. Is proskuneo and aspazome to icons a development in practice? I would say yes, and I would say the fathers of Nicea II agree with that. Is icon veneration, this broad blanket statement of just respecting, honoring images, is that apostolic? I would say yes too, right? So we just need to be very clear when we're saying that there was a development in the way that images were treated and used. Yes, we can say that there was a development in that, right? But some people are going to define veneration so broad that you can no longer say that that was a development. So just be very, very clear here. What is a development exactly, okay? I think that's very important. Let's continue.
There's the Synod of Elvira in the early 300s, which bans all images in worship. It's very clear.
The Synod of Elvira is up to interpretation. There are multiple interpretations of what this even means. The Latin is very ambiguous. Dr. Robin Jensen talks about some of the interpretations of it. Not all of the interpretations make it aniconic. Okay, so it's very important to look at the scholarship on that council, especially Dr. Robin Jensen, who's an excellent scholar and expert in the field. And she really debunks this idea that the Council of Elvira is this, condemnation of images. So I'd recommend that as a source. Let's continue.
The overwhelming testimony is that Christians did not have images in the early church.
That's absolutely not true. That is absolutely not true. The early church absolutely did have images, right? Because we still have them in the archaeology. We just need to be really careful, again, painting these blanket statements. Scholars like Dr. Robin Jensen are going to say that there probably were images in the 3rd century churches, probably even earlier than that, that were just destroyed, because the only images that we have today are images that were buried underground, which implies that images which were not buried underground were just simply destroyed. Not that they never existed. And then we have other scholars who are going to say that, well, there was probably an even earlier icon tradition in Greco-Judean circles. So Jews who were influenced by Greek art and Greek customs, who incorporated iconography into their religious practices that the early Christians inherited. Now, this is a very interesting theory, because it means that icon veneration or icons being used in the church doesn't go back just to the apostles, but even before it. And the early Christians were continuing the practice of using icons in their religious areas. So to say again that no icons were in the churches, or that early Christians didn't have images, is just simply not true. We have plenty of evidence to argue that they did have images in their churches.
And the historical evidence is so strong that the Roman Catholic Church, which does venerate icons, which does adhere to Nicea II, is forced to admit this. They admit that icon veneration is a development.
Yeah, again, when you say icon veneration is a development, what do you mean veneration? You mean protoskinesis to an image? Because I think that the fathers of Nicea II would even say that proskinesis to an image is a development. Okay, but does veneration for you mean something broader, like respecting or honoring an image? That probably goes way back, okay, way back to the apostles, probably even before then, if there were images in Greco-Jewish circles. So you just got to be very clear with that. And I can't speak for all Catholics, but I do know that certain Catholic apologists do make this distinction. They're very clear about what was development, what was not. I would disagree with anybody who says that icon veneration is a doctrinal development, because veneration, again, it's an act of the body. It's something you do in practice. It's not something you believe. It's not a statement of faith. So there would be no, in the view of the Fathers of Nicea II, there is no development of faith or doctrine, but there is room for development of practice. So I think that's a very important distinction to make as well. Let's continue.
John Henry Newman, who's a doctor of the Roman Catholic Church, his theory of development of doctrine says, the early church didn't venerate icons. Over time, we realized why the incarnation lets us venerate icons. Now we venerate icons, but it's fine that they didn't. We admit they didn't. And most Catholic apologists today, like Trent Horn, will admit the early church didn't venerate icons and were highly iconoclast.
I'm going to remind Redeemed Zoomer here again that if the goalposts are set by Nicea II doesn't say that the apostles did proskineo to icons. Okay, so if by veneration you mean proskineo, the council never even makes that claim. So those aren't even part of the goalposts. I just want to throw that out there. But if by veneration you mean they had images or showed some kind of honor to them in some way, well, yeah, that, you could make that argument. But either way, you're going to have to interpret Nicea II. And really, if Nicea II didn't make the claim that the apostles did proskinesis to images, then what does it matter whether or not there's images or evidence for proskinesis to images? It's just totally irrelevant, right? So all of this would be completely irrelevant to the validity of Nicea II if Nicea II doesn't even make these claims. Let's continue.
But here's the problem. Eastern Orthodox don't believe in development of doctrine in the Roman Catholic John Henry Newman sense. They hold to a strict, literal interpretation of Nicea II.
I would say that Gavin Ortlund holds to a very strict and literal and fundamentalist and extreme interpretation of Nicea II that goes well beyond what the Fathers of Nicea II intended. And I think, unfortunately, a lot of Orthodox follow Gavin in his interpretation of Nicea II. I think the Fathers of Nicea II were much more nuanced and careful with their language. And I think that the nuances in their teaching often gets overlooked. Do we follow the Council of Nicea II? Absolutely. Do believe what it's teaching? Yes, absolutely. But we also need to recognize the limits of what it's teaching and not go too far. So I would say that, don't blanket statement all Orthodox Christians as interpreting it in the same way. Not all Orthodox interpret Nicea II in the same way. There are plenty of Orthodox scholars who would say that there is room in Nicea II for the development of practice, the development of how icons are being shown honor, okay, the development of proskineo into the life of the church. But yeah, to blanket statement the whole Orthodox as if we interpret Nicea II the same way, just like Gavin Ortlund, that's not accurate. Okay, that's just demonstrably false. Let's continue.
Which claims icon veneration is an unbroken tradition of the apostles.
What do you mean veneration, right? You mean proskineo? Because we don't, we don't say that, and neither does Nicea II.
But the historical evidence is really strongly against that. Basically, all the scholarship admits the early church did not venerate icons. Roman Catholic scholars, Protestant scholars, even some Eastern Orthodox scholars admit that because the evidence is just so overwhelming. The only people who really claim that the early church venerated icons in the Nicea II sense are Eastern Orthodox online propagandists. There's a massive gap, as Gavin Ortlund points out, between the scholarship and what people say in the online apologetic circles.
Now this point blows my mind, okay? Because it seems like Redeemed Zoomer is making the claim that the only people who believe that Nicea II teaches that the apostles venerated icons or believe that the apostles venerated icons are online apologists. And he even says that Orthodox scholars don't make this claim.
Even some Eastern Orthodox scholars.
Which I think is very interesting because this video is not targeting online Orthodox apologists, is targeting orthodoxy in general, right? So my challenge and my question for Redeemed Zoomer is, well, if you think that the online apologists are misinterpreting the historical narrative, why not just go with the Orthodox scholars instead if they're saying something that's true? Okay, so if Redeemed Zoomer is saying, okay, the online apologists are having this, joke historical interpretation, but the Orthodox scholars have a healthy and good interpretation of history, why reject orthodoxy on the grounds of the online apologists? And why not go with the Orthodox scholars? Okay, so I think it's very interesting, that he makes this. He seems to recognize that just because something is said on the online apologetic sphere doesn't mean that the Orthodox Church as a whole interprets it that way, or our scholars interpret it that way. But why reject orthodoxy on the terms of online apologists then, if our best scholars are not saying these things? So that would just be my question for him. I don't know, if he connected those dots, but I would say, if that's such a hang-up, then go with what the priests are teaching, what the bishops are teaching, what the councils are saying, what the Orthodox scholars are saying, right? If you find that those things are more harmonious and congruent, then just ignore what's going on the online apologetic sphere if you find it problematic. But what I'm seeing is that he's sort of judging all of Orthodoxy by what's going on the online sphere, which, I'm not going to, point fingers at online apologists, but if that's such a hang up for Redeemed Zoomer, then just don't even pay attention to what's going on online. Go to our best resources then and judge orthodoxy by those.
Here's a brief timeline. In the beginning, there was no icon veneration. After Constantine, after Nicea, which was good, by the way. I'm not one of those people who are like, Constantine ruined Christianity. But there was a massive influx of pagans, so we should not be surprised that some of their pagan practices were synthesized with Christianity. So there.
This timeline is the actual joke view of history, because this is demonstrably false. We have references to images in the writings of Tertullian and Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century. So there's no room to say that there was no images in the churches. The best you can say is that there were certain writers who were speaking from their local churches as having no images. I think that's the farthest you can push it. But scholars like Dr. Robin Jensen are going to examine each of these early writers in their own writings in context, in their own arguments, and she's going to come to the conclusion herself that not all early Christians were against images, right? There was no general aniconism in the early church, because she talks about aniconism in the early church, and she paints a much more complex image than what Redeemed Zoomer is painting here. So there was no general aniconism or of iconoclasm. Okay, there's no basis for saying that there was no icon veneration. Maybe there was, maybe there wasn't. So this timeline is actually the joke view of history.
There was a rise in icon veneration, but there was also a lot of backlash. And that backlash came to a head in 754 with the Council of Hieria, which banned all images of God whatsoever. And images of God were replaced with crosses and Bibles. But then just 30 years later, the Second Council of Nicea completely undid that and anathematized all the iconoclasts, saying that anyone who rejects the veneration of icons is a heretic. It says, to those who don't kiss the holy icons, anathema. And
it says, to those who do not give a spasome to icons, anathema. Okay, and a spasome means greeting. It doesn't mean kiss. Okay, Greek has another word for kiss. Now, greeting is typically expressed with a kiss, but not necessarily with a kiss. So again, you've got to be really careful with these bold blanket statements, right? You're anathema if you don't kiss the icons, and anathema if you don't greet the icons. What do you mean greet, right? And what's behind that greeting, right? What's the faith and the understanding of that icon behind the greeting? All these are very important distinctions.
People who convened Nicea II were like, yeah, anathema means you're going to hell. It's not like, oh, anathema is just a nice suggestion to please stop saying that. No.
And you know who else had anathemas? Paul the Apostle, the First Council of Nicea. Is just a normal part of councils. That's what they do. They come up with some kind of definition or creed. They come up with some canons and some anathemas. That's the formula for all the ecumenical councils. So naturally there's going to be anathemas in the Seventh Ecumenical Council, because that's what councils do. So I don't see why this is very surprising. It shouldn't be surprising. It's been going on since the very beginning. From the time of the apostles, Paul himself is using the word anathema So that's not shocking or surprising at all. The question is about whether or not you agree with the teaching of Nicaea, not whether or not it should use anathemas. Of course, it uses anathemas. Let's continue.
Anathema meant you're going to hell at Nicea II. So Nicea II basically anathematized the whole early church. So that's why...
No, it doesn't anathematize the whole early church because, again, the aniconic view does not apply to all the churches in the early church.
A strict reading of Nicea II, which the Orthodox Church holds to, is not compatible with church history. Okay.
So there we have it. What do you think about Redeemed Zoomer's arguments? Do you think they were any good? How would you respond to some of these? If you find this topic interesting, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button for future content. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.
If